Hercule Poirot and the Song That Was Never Written. Chapter 1. The Suspended Note. Dawn was falling gently over the wooden roofs of the village of Saint-Rémy-des-Vents, a charming and somewhat forgotten corner of the French countryside. There, among vineyards and overgrown gardens, stood an ancient and mysterious villa known as the Voice of the Wind, home of the celebrated retired composer Madame Héloïse d'Hervaux, a woman who, according to local legend, could translate her deepest emotions into scores that made angels weep. Yet she hadn't written a single note for years. That morning, the local gardener, Etienne, pushed open the creaking gate of the property, like every Monday. With a watering can in one hand and a half-eaten roll in the other, he didn't expect to find anything out of the ordinary. But something in the atmosphere stopped him. The blackbird's songs seemed absent. The central fountain wasn't bubbling as usual, and at the top of the stone steps the villa's gate stood ajar. Madame Héloïse, he called, his voice trembling. There was no response. As he cautiously climbed in, he heard a discordant note in the air. An unfinished, barely audible melody came from the piano in the living room. He entered holding his breath. There, seated, at the piano, one hand draped over the keys and the other clutching a blank sheet of paper, lay Madame d'Hervaux. Her face displayed an almost theatrical serenity, as if death had arrived with the elegance of a final chord. The local doctor pronounced her death a natural death. No one suspected otherwise, until her niece, Camille d'Hervaux, arrived that same afternoon. Camille was young, determined, and anything but naive. After a few minutes in the room, her voice rang out clearly. This wasn't natural. My aunt was afraid. A week ago, she wrote to me saying someone was threatening her over a piece of music, a song she never got around to writing. Commissioner Bernard Latour, a tall, practical man with a square moustache and little patience for what he considered women's fantasies, dismissed the insinuations. There were no signs of a struggle. Nothing was missing. And, as if that weren't enough, the will left the property to Camille, which immediately made her the prime suspect in the eyes of some. And what about the blank sheet of paper she was holding? Camille asked, her tone accusatory. For a woman who hadn't composed anything in years, why die with an empty score in her hands? Latour shrugged. Maybe he was looking for inspiration. But Camille didn't give up. That same night, she sent an urgent telegram to London. She didn't know if she would make it, but there was only one person capable of uncovering the truth hidden among silences and unwritten notes, a mind guided not by what was seen, but by what was hidden in the most subtle details. 2 days later, a train arrived at the village station. A short man stepped off, impeccably dressed in a light grey cloth coat, a perfectly knotted tie, and shoes that shone like marble. His moustache was, as always, perfectly symmetrical. Mademoiselle Camille d'Hervaux, he said with a slight bow. I am Hercule Poirot. I have been told that the music has fallen silent in this house. Let us see if the little grey cells can make it speak. Camille guided him through the villa. Poirot examined every corner with the sharp eye of someone who listens to what others don't. Tell me, mademoiselle, he said as he reached the parlour where the black grand piano lay. Do you think your aunt really feared for her life? I know, she replied firmly. In her letter, She told me about someone pressuring her about a piece she'd sworn she wouldn't write. A song that could ruin someone's life. But she didn't tell me who it was. Poirot stroked the edge of the blank sheet of paper still lying on the piano. And yet he died with this in his hands. Fascinating. Silence sometimes screams, "Mademoiselle!" Before leaving, Poirot turned slowly and asked, "Who was in the house the night before Madame Dervaux died?" In addition to the domestic staff, 3 people: Monsieur Hugo Leclerc, his former protégé and now rising composer; Madame Odette Moreau, his longtime confidant and housekeeper; and Monsieur Julien Lenoir, a music critic who arrived unannounced. Poirot nodded, his mind already forming invisible patterns. The blank page, a song never written, 3 visitors with ulterior motives, and a death without witnesses. "Well, mademoiselle," he said finally, "the score may be empty, but the melody of crime is just beginning." Chapter 2. 3 visits and 1 confession. The next morning dawned with a thick fog over the vineyards of Saint-Rémy-des-Vents. Poirot, after his morning ritual of toileting and a meticulously balanced breakfast, requested to gather the 3 visitors who had been with Madame Dervaux before her death. It wasn't yet a formal accusation, simply, as he explained with his unmistakable Belgian accent, a conversation to tune the ear before beginning the symphony of truth. First came Hugo Leclerc. Tall, with unruly hair and an air of dramatic intensity in every movement, Hugo entered the room with steps marked by a mixture of anxiety and pride. "Madame Dervaux trained me. Without her I'd be nothing," he declared. But lately, something in her had changed. Poirot watched him closely, not so much the words, but the pauses between them. "In what way has it changed, monsieur?" She was paranoid. She thought someone was trying to steal a work she hadn't written. She told me a melody came to her in her dreams, and if anyone else heard it, tragedy would follow. "And did you hear it, that melody?" Hugo smiled sadly. "Never," she said. "I didn't exist yet, that I hadn't been born yet." Poirot narrowed his eyes. "And yet, monsieur, she died clinging to a blank page. Isn't that an interrupted act of composition?" Hugo didn't know what to say. He lowered his gaze and left, without adding anything else. Then Mrs. Odette Moreau appeared, small, dressed in mourning, with carefully coiled grey hair and a porcelain face cracked by age. She had served Eloise for more than 3 decades, and her loyalty was almost legendary in the village. "Monsieur Poirot, if I may say so, my lady didn't fear for her life. She feared for her soul. She believed that by writing that song, she would bring back something that should remain buried." "A secret, perhaps?" suggested Poirot. "I don't know, monsieur. I only know that he didn't sleep well. He would get up at night, play the piano silently, and then burn what he wrote." "He burned his scores?" Odette nodded with a shudder. "All of them, except one. The last one, she didn't have time." Poirot dismissed her politely and asked Camille to search the remains of the fireplace or the desk for any partially charred papers. Finally, Julien Lenoir entered. The music critic was thin, elegant, with round glasses and a voice as soft as a cello in its low register. "Poirot," I suppose you're going to ask me what I was doing here uninvited. I admit I was forward. I came to interview Madame for a book I'm writing on retired composers. And he received her with courtesy? As always. Although I was surprised, I found her more fragile, more mystical. She told me that you can't trust sounds. That sounds lie. Interesting phrase, Mr. Lenoir. Oh, and he also said something else curious. If I ever disappear, don't look among the sounds, but in the silences. Poirot didn't reply immediately. He walked over to the piano. He lifted the lid and examined the keyboard. Then he looked at the music stand. There were light marks on its surface, as if a leaf had been lying there for a long time. You, Monsieur Lenoir, did you hear Madame Dervaux play that evening? No. When I came downstairs, he had already left. I made myself a cognac in the library, and then went upstairs to sleep. I didn't hear the piano. Poirot smiled barely. Curious, sir, because the gardener swore he heard a melody when he entered the house the next morning. An unfinished melody. How do you explain that? Julian narrowed his eyes. Don't know. Poirot thanked him for his time, but his mind was already working at a different pace. A song that didn't exist. Visitors with fragmentary memories. A blank page that perhaps wasn't so empty. And a woman writing, silently just to burn her thoughts. That evening, Poirot asked to be left alone in the living room with the piano. Camille found him there at midnight. He was playing a single note with one finger, over and over again, thoughtful. Are you looking for something, Monsieur Poirot? I'm hearing what no one wanted to hear, mademoiselle, because the problem isn't that the song was never written, but that someone went out of their way to make sure no one heard it. Poirot calmly rose, took a step towards the fireplace, and picked up a badly burned piece of paper. One word survived among the ashes. Confession. Chapter 3. A trail among the ashes. The sun had not yet fully touched the hills when Hercule Poirot carefully examined the fragment rescued from the chimney. The piece of paper, blackened at its edges, revealed little more than an incomplete word. Confession. Written in black ink, firm, without a title, delicately, as if afraid the air would destroy it. Or maybe she was reading it. What if this sheet wasn't written by her, but she? Perhaps, mademoiselle, your aunt received a confession, and never lived to reveal it. Camille paled. Are you implying that she was murdered? Poirot turned to her gravely. It didn't seem like part of a score, but a note, or something more intimate. Camille, who had been watching silently from the doorway, took a step forward. Do you think my aunt was going to write a confession, Monsieur Poirot? Poirot raised the piece of paper. Insinuate, no. Consider, yes. But to affirm it, I need more than a word among ashes. Later, Poirot headed to the library. There, surrounded by leather-bound editions, he found something curious. An open book on the desk. Silence and composition. The power of the unwritten. Underlined in pencil, a sentence stood out. Sometimes the truest music is the one that never plays. Poirot sat thoughtfully, slowly flipping through the pages. A folded newspaper clipping fell between them. An article signed by Julien Lenoir, dated 2 years earlier. Genie or ghost? The silent Dervaux. In it, Lenoir suggested that Madame Héloïse was living off her past fame, and that her lack of recent output was a sign of decadence rather than mystery. The words were harsh, even cruel. Poirot frowned. A man who criticizes so publicly, and then shows up at your house uninvited. That's not curiosity. That's debt, or fear. Shortly after, Poirot asked to speak to Odette Moreau again. The woman, although tired, did not refuse. "Mrs. Moreau," he began, "were you aware of any unannounced visitors in the last few days? Someone who didn't show up, but who might have left something in writing?" She was slow to respond. She shifted in her chair, folding her hands. "Letter arrived 3 days before her death," he said finally. "I didn't deliver it. It was anonymous. And there was no return address. I was afraid it would upset Madame Eloise more than she already was. So I hid it at the bottom of the dining-room cupboard drawer. I'm sorry, Monsieur Poirot. I didn't know if I was doing the right thing." Poirot stood up immediately. "Mademoiselle Camille, would you accompany me? It's time to look for what was left untouched, and perhaps find what was left unsaid." The drawer creaked with a melancholy that seemed to know what it was hiding. Between linen tablecloths and silver spoons, a sealed envelope appeared. No name, no address, just a single sheet of paper inside, written in uneven, shaky handwriting. Poirot read in a low voice, while Camille watched him without daring to breathe. "I can't keep silent any longer. That night in Vienna wasn't an accident. It was her. Eloise knew it. And if that song ever sees the light of day, everything will be known. She promised to keep it. But if she breaks her word, I'll have to act. May God forgive me." "Vienna?" Camille asked. "What happened in Vienna?" Poirot looked at her for a long time before answering. "That, mademoiselle, is what we must now discover. Because whoever wrote this note feared that their secret would be revealed through a song." Camille looked at him in amazement. "Do you mean that the music was a way of giving him away?" Poirot nodded slowly. "Madame Dervaux was a woman who spoke better with chords than with words. Perhaps that song never written was her way of denouncing something that had been haunting her for years. And that put someone on the ropes." That evening, Poirot requested that no one leave the villa. He gathered the 3 visitors and Camille in the drawing-room, in front of the piano, where the atmosphere was so tense that even silence seemed to hold one's breath. An unspoken confession, a hidden letter, and a dreaded melody. "Mes amis, we are surrounded by invisible music and all too audible lies," Poirot declared. "Someone in this room is lying. But don't worry, we'll soon sort out the facts." And as he spoke, Poirot slowly placed the fragment of charred paper on the piano stand, because this story still has many notes to play. Chapter 4. Echoes of Vienna. The night was dense and silent, as if the wind of Saint-Rémy-de-Vent itself had withdrawn to listen. Poirot stood by the piano, the charred fragment still in his hand, and the anonymous envelope visible to everyone. No one present said a word. "Well," Poirot said finally, his voice level, "we've had many answers these days, but few truths. Now we must go back to a place that everyone seems to avoid." 1. Julien Lenoir was the first to speak. "Vienna? I don't know what you're referring to." "Oh, monsieur," replied Poirot, with a dry smile, "your name appears in the records of the National Conservatory of Music in Vienna, 1932, a conference attended by you and Madame Dervaux." Julien remained still, although the slight twitch in his left eyebrow betrayed his surprise. Yes, I was there, but I barely spoke to Eloise. We were distant colleagues. And Hugo Leclerc? Asked Poirot, turning gently. Where were you then? Hugo shrugged. I hadn't yet entered Madame's circle. I was just a student, but yes, I knew of her fame, her winter sonata. And you, Madame Moreau? Interrupted Poirot. The housekeeper blinked, confused. Me, sir? I've never left France. Poirot nodded, watching the reactions. So, Mademoiselle Camille, he continued, tell me, did your aunt ever tell you about a tragic or traumatic event related to Vienna? Camille hesitated. Not directly. But I remember that he once taught me an untitled melody. He told me that was what remained of a night that no one wanted to remember. I asked him if it was his. He replied, not quite. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Interesting. A melody without an owner, like a crime without a culprit. Could you play it for me? Camille hesitated, but then sat down at the piano. Her fingers, though hesitant at first, began to glide familiarly over the keys. A soft, melancholic melody floated through the air. It had echoes of a Viennese waltz, but distorted, as if the music were hiding scars. When he finished, no one spoke for several seconds. That piece, Julien suddenly exclaimed. I heard it before, in Vienna, during a private evening. How is that possible? Poirot watched him intently. Then you remembered. And yet you said you barely spoke to Madame Dervaux. Julien swallowed. It was a strange night. There was an accident. A young man fell from the theatre balcony. Everyone said he tripped, but some thought he was pushed. And who was that young man? A promising violinist. His name was Lucas Feld. He admired Eloise. Some said he was obsessed with her. Poirot turned slowly on his heels. And what connection did he have with you, Monsieur Leclerc? Hugo paled visibly. None. I only heard about him through rumours. Poirot folded his hands behind his back. Curious, because I found a letter among your aunt's belongings. A letter signed by Feld, sent months before her death. In it, he talked about arrogant pupil, that he had copied her work, and how he had been silenced by the great lady of harmony. The silence became even thicker. Camille, said Poirot, could you bring me your aunt's box of personal sheet music? The code, in the study, locked. When Camille returned, she was carrying a black lacquered box. Poirot opened it delicately, going through folder after folder, until he found what he was looking for, an untitled score on yellowish paper. Along its bottom edge, a line written in pencil, rewritten but not forgotten. LF. Poirot turned to the group. My friends, I'm beginning to see the structure of this broken symphony. A young violinist died under suspicious circumstances. A melody was buried in oblivion, and someone among you lived in fear that this song would reveal more than musical notes. His eyes settled on each face, one by one. The fear was palpable, the tension unbreakable. I've already said too much. We've yet to hear the final voice of this orchestra. Poirot closed the box, and with a solemn gesture, withdrew. Tomorrow, he announced, I'll call you all into the main hall, and then, with the permission of the little grey cells, I'll reveal who the true mastermind of this tragedy was. Chapter 5. Notes on the Margin of Silence. Dawn brought with it a silence thicker than mist. The village, the voice of the wind, seemed to hold his breath, as if Héloïse Dervaux's death had suspended in the air not only sounds, but secrets. Poirot got up early, spending more time than usual on his attire, as if the order of his tie might influence the order of the events he was about to unravel. After breakfast, he asked Camille to accompany him to his aunt's private study. It was a room she said was rarely opened, and that Madame Dervaux used only on stormy days. The key hung on a cord inside her bedroom wardrobe, protected like a relic. The interior of the studio had a distinct feel from the rest of the house. Walls covered in navy blue velvet, a floor lamp with teardrop-shaped crystals, and a small display case with carefully lined-up personal items. An embroidered handkerchief, a sealed locket, and a small picture frame. Poirot stopped in front of the portrait. It was the image of a young man with a shy look and a sharp face, a violin resting on his shoulder. Camille immediately recognized him from the recovered letters. Lucas Feld. What was the real relationship between them, mademoiselle? Poirot asked, quietly. Mentor and pupil, or something more? I never knew for sure, Camille admitted. But my aunt kept that portrait for decades. She never mentioned it, and yet she never took it out of her studio. Sometimes she stared at it for hours, as if listening for something she could no longer touch. Poirot nodded gravely. His eyes then shifted to the piano in the study, smaller than the one in the drawing-room, but equally well kept. On it lay a red leather-bound notebook, closed with a silk bow. Camille carefully untied it, and together they reviewed the contents. Notes, musical outlines, lyrical fragments, intimate reflections. Even a crumpled sheet at the end, on which was written with a trembling hand a solitary sentence. If I remained silent in Vienna, it wasn't out of cowardice. It was out of love. Poirot repeated the words in a low voice, as if trying to capture their emotional resonance. Then he addressed Camille delicately. Her aunt was determined to confess, but not with words. With music, the song that was never written. It was a warning, a poetic revenge. Later that morning, Poirot requested a second interview with Odette Moreau. This time he didn't go to the drawing-room. He invited her to the terrace, where the sound of the wind through the cypresses seemed to carry old echoes. Mrs. Moreau, he began, I need you to be completely honest with me, not only out of loyalty to the truth, but out of loyalty to your mistress. The old woman looked at him with a hurt expression. What do you want to know? Did you know of any letter sent by Madame Dervaux before her death? A message intended for someone who doesn't live here? Odette hesitated. Her fingers tightened on the woolen shawl that covered her shoulders. There was a letter. She dictated it to me the night before she died. She asked me not to use her handwriting, that I copy it. It was for Mr. Leclerc. She demanded a confession from him. A confession of what, madam? Odette looked down. She never said it directly. But I understood that Hugo had something to do with Lucas's downfall. That the song Héloïse was rewriting was originally his young Feld's, and that Hugo had plagiarized it years before, using his influence to erase all traces of its origin. Poirot took a deep breath. The cold air now had the taste of stagnant justice. And did you send the letter? No. She asked me to deliver it in the morning. But when I went up to wake her, it was too late. I destroyed it. I didn't want anyone to find it. Did you destroy it? Poirot raised an eyebrow. Like you did with the anonymous letter. Odette looked at him scared. I didn't want any scandals. I just wanted to protect her. But by concealing the truth, Poirot replied with grave gentleness, you allowed the death to pass as silence, not as a crime. At noon, Poirot met with Commissioner Latour at the small local police office. He handed him the letters, the burned fragment, the musical notes, and a detailed list of chronological events. I have no forensic evidence, mon ami, said Poirot, but I have the logic. I have the silences, and I have the melody. Isn't that sometimes more eloquent than a trail of blood? Latour snorted, but accepted the documents. And what do you propose? One last meeting, with everyone present, tonight, in the living room. So that, Poirot smiled, stroking his moustache, so that they hear, finally, the truth. Chapter 6. The Meeting in the Hall. At 8 o'clock sharp, everyone was gathered in the great hall of the Voice of the Wind. The curtains were drawn, the lamps lit with a soft golden glow. A faint scent of melted wax floated in the air. Hercule Poirot, impeccably dressed in a black satin waistcoat and white pocket square, stood in front of the piano, as if about to give a concert. Camille, sitting by the fireplace, held the untitled score in her hands. Around her, Julien Lenoir, Hugo Leclerc, and Odette Moreau maintained an uneasy silence. Commissioner Latour stood in the background, arms crossed, and a sceptical expression. My friends, Poirot began calmly, we are in the final phase of this mystery. A woman has died, a crime has been committed, and a song, which seemed not to exist, has revealed itself as a powerful threat. Now is the time to put the notes in order and expose the complete score. Everyone's eyes were on him. First, the reason, the truth. Madame d'Hervaux possessed dangerous information, a truth hidden for decades, ever since a night in Vienna in 1932. A young prodigy, Lucas Feld, fell from a balcony. It was said to be an accident. But Madame d'Hervaux knew better. She knew it was a murder concealed by jealousy and betrayal. A shudder ran through the room. Hugo shifted in his seat. And what proof do you have of that, Monsieur Poirot? A letter your aunt wrote and never sent. A confession she wrote in music. And more importantly, your reactions, Monsieur Leclerc. From the beginning, you've tried to appear unrelated to Vienna, but you were there. As a student, yes, but also as a witness, and even more, as a thief. That's slander. Poirot raised a hand. Please, let's hear the facts. Madame d'Hervaux had begun composing a piece titled simply, The One That Must Not Be. Sounded? It was, in fact, a reconstruction of a work by Feld. A work that you, Monsieur Leclerc, plagiarized and presented as your own years, after that young man's concealed suicide. Your rise began just after his death. Coincidence, isn't it? Hugo's face turned ashen. You can't prove anything. Perhaps not with ink and paper, but music, monsieur, doesn't lie. Camille played us an incomplete version of that melody. Julien Lenoir, who was also in Vienna, recognized it immediately. and I found among Madame Dervaux's personal archives a score signed with the initials A.L.F. You wanted to destroy all evidence, but your teacher preserved the memory of the crime in silence. Poirot took a step forward. And then there's the anonymous letter, the veiled threat. If that song ever sees the light of day, everything will be known. You, Leclerc, were afraid that Eloise would reveal your plagiarism. But even more so, you were afraid of resurrecting a scandal that would destroy your reputation. So you came back. You feigned a friendly visit. You waited for the right moment, and in the early hours you poisoned her. The silence was absolute. Poison her? Latour asked sceptically. How? There were no traces. Exactly, interrupted Poirot. No visible signs, no struggle, just absolute calm. Because he used something subtle, digitalis, easy to obtain if one is familiar with common flowers, like the didelleras growing next to the garden fence. And you, Monsieur Leclerc, were seen there several times in the previous days, gathering inspiration, as you said. Hugo stood up suddenly, his face disfigured. Enough! This is a theatre. No, monsieur, Poirot replied, with a penetrating look. This is justice. You murdered Madame Dervaux to silence her, but she won, because she left traces, in notes, in memories, in silences, and now that melody will be played. Her story will not die with her. Commissioner Latour took a step forward. Do you have anything to declare, Mr. Leclerc? Hugo didn't respond. He put his hands to his face. After a long moment he murmured, I didn't want to do it. She made me, with that look, with that music. I couldn't stand the thought of everything getting out. I stole everything. And she was going to destroy me. Poirot nodded gravely. Wasn't the melody that destroyed him, monsieur. It was his conscience. Later, as the police escorted Hugo from the villa, Camille and Poirot remained alone by the piano. So what are you going to do with the score now? She asked. Poirot watched the silent musical lines. Perhaps it's better if it's never played. Some melodies don't need ears, only justice. Camille closed the score slowly, as if closing a coffin. Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. He smiled, stroking his moustache. You're welcome, mademoiselle. But remember, in every symphony, even the saddest, there's a redeeming note, and that's the one we mustn't forget. Chapter 7. The Note That Never. Sounded the next morning. The voice of the winded was strangely quiet. There were no hurried footsteps in the hallways, no suspicious murmurs in the corners. With Hugo Leclerc's confession and his surrender to the authorities, the veil of silence that had enveloped the house was beginning to lift. And yet something remained, something that hadn't quite healed. Hercule Poirot, true to form, had already finished his breakfast and was in the greenhouse, inspecting the violet-flowered foxgloves with his crooked-handled cane. He touched the leaves with extreme care, like someone examining final proofs before completing a symphony. Camille arrived with a serene expression, but her eyes were still clouded from the night of revelations. Monsieur Poirot, she said softly, I was wondering if there was anything I could do for you. Poirot looked at her with a gentle glow. Mademoiselle, I came to this house to restore the harmony of truth. But there is one last measure, one last note that has not been sounded. Do you mean to the song, the original score? The music of Lucas Fell, the piece that her aunt tried to reconstruct. Camille nodded. "Do you want me to touch you?" Poirot shook his head gently. "No, I want you to keep it, to protect it, to decide whether it should be heard or not." That music was born of pain, betrayal, and frustrated love. It's not just any composition, it's a testimony. And some testimonies should speak only when the world is ready to understand them. Camille took a deep breath. For the first time in days, she seemed weightless. "Then I'll keep it, not as a relic, but as a warning." Poirot smiled. "Very sensible. But before I leave, I'd like to speak with Madame Moreau. There's still a doubt in my thoughts, a dissonance, if you will, in the dining room." Madame Moreau had already served tea when Poirot entered. The old woman greeted him with a mixture of respect and caution. "Madame Moreau," he said as he sat down, "you have served this house for decades. You have been faithful to Madame d'Hervaux in her days of glory and in her days of darkness. But now that the truth has come to light, there is something you have left unsaid." She looked down. It wasn't out of malice, it was out of fear of what that truth could break. "Are you referring to young Feld?" She nodded. "I was there in Vienna, not as a guest but as Eloise's companion. No one noticed me. But I saw everything. I saw how that young prodigy grew closer to her every day, how he inspired her, and how Hugo, then just an ambitious young man, imitated him. Eloise debated between protecting him and not reporting him. Why didn't he do it? Because Lucas loved her. Because Hugo admired her too, morbidly. And because she didn't want the world to know what she had allowed. Plagiarism was the price she paid for silence. But as she grew older, the guilt began to eat away at her. Poirot looked at her with compassion. And that's why he decided to write the song, to correct what words couldn't. "Yes," Moreau whispered, "but it was too late." "It's never too late for the truth," Poirot said gently, "even if it comes like an echo." That same afternoon, as the train whistled in the distance, Poirot said goodbye to Camille at the village station. The sky was clear for the first time in days. There was no music, but the silence was no longer oppressive. It was peace. "What will you do now, Monsieur Poirot?" "Oh, I have a lot of things waiting for me," he replied. "But first, a nice window seat and a cup of hot chocolate. The perfect accompaniment to reflect on the tragedy and the beauty of the unspoken." Camille handed him a small velvet-wrapped package. "And this, a copy of the score, in case you ever want to hear it." Poirot accepted it carefully, but did not open it. "Perhaps one day, mademoiselle, when the notes don't hurt, and the world listens without judgment." The train started moving. Camille stood, watching the Belgian detective disappear into the mist of the hills. And so, the song that was never written found its place in the silence that never lied. Chapter 8. The Ebony Box. 2 weeks had passed since Hercule Poirot left Saint-Remy-des-Vents. The case, although solved in the eyes of the law, continued to throb in the corners of the town. The voice of the windlike. A melody not quite finished. Camille, now her sole legal heir, moved through the house with cautious steps, as if each room spoke to her in her aunt's voice. He had closed the studio. He had handed the sealed scores over to a notary for safekeeping. But there was one place he hadn't dared return to. The attic. Eloise Dervaux called him the sounding board of your past, and no one, not even Odette Moreau, was allowed to go up there. Until now, one grey afternoon, as a soft drizzle tapped against the window panes, Camille climbed the wooden steps, holding her aunt's lantern. The air smelled of dust, aged paper, and old varnish. The attic was filled with trunks, instrument cases, framed portraits, and piles of books stacked haphazardly. In the centre, like a sleeping black heart, rested ebony box locked with a padlock. On the lid, engraved in Gothic letters, the initials L.F. Camille swallowed. He didn't have the key, but the lock was old, and the metal yielded easily with firm pressure. Inside, he found an array of objects arranged with reverential care. A hand-knit wool scarf, a sheet of music framed with cracked glass, an old audio tape labelled simply Night 32, and an unopened envelope addressed to the person who still seeks justice. Camille opened the letter with trembling hands. If you're reading this, it means I couldn't finish what I started. This box belongs to Lucas Feld, not as property, but as a testament. He was the purest inspiration I've ever known, and the most silently suffering soul. This tape contains the only known recording of his final performance, a piece of his own, a piece that was taken, distorted, and sold to the world as someone else's. I was a coward. I didn't defend him, but I tried in the end to do him justice. Don't give this recording to the public if they're only looking for beauty. Do it if they're looking for true. It is D. Camille stood motionless, the tape in her hand. The silence of the attic now took on a different texture. A weight, an echo, a judgment suspended in time. Hours later, using an old tape recorder salvaged from the studio, Camille inserted the tape. The sound was harsh, filled with static, but little by little a melody emerged. At first it was timid, as if the music doubted its own right to exist. Then something changed. The chords grew intense with a raging beauty. It was pain and redemption, desire and surrender. The piece seemed to build itself up, and at the same time crumble note by note. It had no title, but Camille knew immediately what it was, the song that was never written. Because I didn't need a score, just emotion. When it ended, the silence was as profound as the music had been sublime. Camille cried, not because of his aunt's death, not because of Leclerc's betrayal, but because of Lucas Feld, whose voice had finally been heard, in its purest form. A few days later, he received a letter from London. The sender was Hercule Poirot. Miss Camille, my thoughts still turn to you and to the house that holds so many melodies yet to be discovered. I've thought a lot about our case, not out of doubt, but out of respect. The soul of a crime doesn't always die with the capture of the culprit. Sometimes it lingers over time like a suspended cord. If you decide to share Lucas's music with the world, do so with courage. But if you decide to keep it, do so with honor. In both cases, I implore you, listen. Listen with your heart, not with your ears. Your devoted friend, Hercule Poirot. Camille put the letter in the ebony box, along with the ribbon. Then he closed the lid and sealed it again. I didn't know if the world would ever hear that music. But now she knew she wasn't alone in his custody. And that, he thought, was enough. For now. Chapter 9. The Ear of Truth. A week after discovering Lucas Feld's recording, Camille found herself in a silent quandary. The tape had revealed more than just music. It had awakened a conflict within her, one that not even Poirot, with his glowing grey cells, could resolve for her. The music, authentic and heartbreaking, was undoubtedly the work of genius. If made public, it would destroy Hugo Leclerc's legacy, which was already hanging by a thread, and open a complex conversation about plagiarism, complicit silence, and the price of fame. But it also meant dragging his aunt's name into a whirlwind of lawsuits she could no longer defend. Camille, who until then had lived in the shadow of her family's musical history, now held it entirely in her hands. That day, an unexpected visitor arrived at the villa, a thin, elegant man with perfectly combed white hair and an aged leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Maxime Leclerc, Hugo's older brother. "I don't come on behalf of my family," he said in a deep voice. "I come on behalf of the truth." Camille, somewhat wary, led him into the living room. She served tea, more out of protocol than hospitality. "What would you like, Monsieur Leclerc?" He looked around the room with eyes filled with memories. Then he took a yellowed sheet of music out of his briefcase. "This is what's left of Lucas Feld's notebook. I rescued it from the conservatory many years ago, when no one else claimed it. I recognized the melody you played weeks ago. The same one I heard as a child in Vienna, just once during a private rehearsal. I've never forgotten it." Camille reached out a trembling hand to take the paper. It was, without a doubt, the skeleton of the play she had heard on the tape. The name fielded appeared crossed out in a corner. Below it, written in fresher ink, Leclerc Sonata. Maxime pointed at it. "My brother wrote that when he stole this piece and completed it as his own, I was a witness and an accomplice, having remained silent for years." "Why now?" Camille asked. "Because justice isn't just imposed in the courts," Maxime said. "It's built on conscience. My brother was ruined by his decisions, yes, but also because he never faced the true weight of what he did. His fall was inevitable. What remains now is redemption." Camille looked down. "And you think that redeeming it involves publishing this?" "No," she replied firmly. "It's about giving Lucas his voice back." That night, Camille listened to the recording once more. This time, she didn't cry. This time, she listened with different ears, those of a woman who understood the power of memory and music, and also their limits. He found the original score and placed Maxime's copy next to it. He compared them. They were structurally similar, but Eloise's version had more subtle nuances, more expressive silences, musical phrases that suggested emotion rather than imposing it. His aunt had not only reconstructed Lucas's music, there was it purified. The next day, Camille made a decision. She went to the Paris Academy of Music, where an old colleague of Eloise's, the maestro René Caillard, still held a respect for her legacy. He gave her the tape, the score, and a handwritten letter. This work was composed by Lucas Feld. It was stolen, silenced, and finally reconstructed by Héloïse Dervaux. May it now be given its correct name. May it be heard not out of nostalgia, but out of justice. Maestro Caillard, moved, promised to present the work at the upcoming memorial recital, not under Leclerc's name, not as part of the Dervaux family repertoire, but as what it was, Sonata for a Silent Witness, by Lucas Feld, restored by Héloïse Dervaux. That night, back at the villa, Camille felt something new. Peaceful silence. The piano, covered by a velvet cloth, was no longer a tomb of secrets. It was a true altar. She lit a candle, placed her aunt's portrait next to Lucas's, and wrote a letter. Mr. Poirot, I've decided to let the music speak, not as a weapon, not as a punishment, but as truth. Lucas Feld will live on in the notes that were denied, and my aunt at last rests not in silence, but in harmony. Yours with gratitude, Camille. He placed it in the envelope, sealed it, and left it next to the piano. A breeze came through the window, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't bring any questions with it. Just a note that no longer needed to be written. Chapter 10. The Concert of Those Who Didn't Return. Paris, 6 months later. The grand hall of the conservatory on the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré was completely packed. Musicians, critics, scholars, and alumni took their seats in a murmur of almost reverent anticipation. This was no ordinary evening. The programme, marked in gold letters, featured a single work. Sonata for a Silent Witness, Lucas Feld, 1909 to 1932, restored by Héloïse Dervaux, 1883-1954. On the stage, a single grand piano waited in semi-darkness. There was no orchestra, no guest soloists, only the soft light falling on the instrument, as if the entire room were waiting for the shadows to dissipate with each chord. Among the audience, sitting in row 6, was Camille. She wore a dark, sober dress, with a small treble clef-shaped brooch that had belonged to her aunt. Discreetly at her side was Maestro René Caillard, who had proudly assumed the responsibility of presenting the work to the world. "Are you ready?" he whispered to her. "I don't know if you're ever ready for this," Camille replied, gently squeezing the folded sheet music in her lap. "But I do know it's fair." In one of the back rows, unannounced, a diminutive gentleman with a gleaming moustache watched intently, not at the performers nor at the audience, but at Camille. Hercule Poirot, incognito, with a curved brim hat and a reserved gaze, had arrived unannounced. Not all endings require words. Some just need witnesses. The pianist entered, young and serene. He greeted the audience and sat down. Silence fell. Then the first notes began. The music was simple at first, as if treading cautiously on newly discovered ground. Then it grew, not with violence, but with a suppressed pain. Each measure was a confession. Each pause, a tear never shed. And in the midst of it all, a desolate beauty. It wasn't a piece meant to shine, but to remember. Remembering Lucas Feld. Remember Héloïse Dervaux. Remember that even in theft, in silence, in betrayal, something immortal could be born. Camille didn't cry. She kept her face straight, even though her hands were shaking. She felt for the first time that both of them, Lucas and her aunt, were there. Not as ghosts, but as notes finally set free. When the last key was pressed, there was no immediate applause, just a prolonged moment of bated breath. Then a burst of applause. But Camille didn't applaud. She simply placed the score on her seat and discreetly left the room, not out of disdain, but because she knew the important thing had already happened. On the sidewalk, under the lit streetlights, she met Poirot, who was waiting for her with a discreet smile. "The melody has spoken, mademoiselle." "And he said, more than any confession," she replied, her eyes shining. "And now, what will you do?" Camille thought about it for a moment. To live, with music, but without the secrets. Poirot nodded. A wise choice. Although, if you'll allow me a recommendation, never lock your piano. You never know when a truth will want to be played. They both laughed softly, like those who have survived not only the mystery, but what comes next. That evening, in a small hotel in the 7th arrondissement, Poirot sat down to write one last entry in his personal notebook. Justice doesn't always take the form of handcuffs or trials. Sometimes it takes the form of a sustained note, a pause, a truth that, after decades of silence, finally finds ears that not only hear, but understand. The song that was never written is no longer written, and with that, the world is a little more in tune. He closed the notebook, turned off the light, and lay back with a satisfied smile. Because in this story, like in a good symphony, every silence had its reason, and each note its place. Chapter 11. The Silence That Remained. Days after the premiere in Paris, critics proclaimed the sonata for a silent witness as the most moving revelation of the season. The newspapers spoke of Lucas Feld as a tragically forgotten genius and of Héloïse Dervaux as a restorer of truths beyond music. However, for Camille, the true legacy wasn't the standing ovation from the audience or the glowing articles. It was the silence that remained. A silence different from before. It was not one of shame or fear, but rather one of a page finally closed. In the voice of the wind. The house was slowly breathing again. The corridors were no longer heavy, and the rooms were alive again. Camille had opened up the studio completely, letting the light stream in each morning onto the manuscripts, the books, the scores. She had the living room piano restored by a luthier from Lyon. She tuned it, not for concerts, but to keep it available, just in case someone else decided to play. One morning, while sorting through old papers, he found a forgotten letter in a book of Verlaine poems. It was addressed to Héloïse, but unsigned. The text was short, just 3 lines, written in a trembling hand. "I wasn't able to save him, but you can still save his voice. Forgive me for hiding it for so long." Camille put the letter away without adding any context. There was no need. The message explained itself. Héloïse hadn't begun reconstructing the sonata out of guilt, but out of promise. That night, under the light rain falling on the windows, Camille wrote a new heading on a blank sheet of paper. Variations for a Broken Memory. It wasn't a continuation of Feld's work. It was his own. An attempt to narrate, with music, the moments that couldn't be described in words. Poirot's visits, the ebony box, the rusty tape, the long pauses between the beats of truth. He composed in silence for weeks, without showing it to anyone. Every evening, a candle. Every night, a musical phrase. Some notes were broken, inharmonious. Others seemed to respond to each other as if in dialogue between two eras. When he finished it, he didn't know if it was a masterpiece or if anyone else would understand it, but he knew she was honest. A month later, Camille received a letter with no return address. The envelope, sealed with red wax, contained a single sheet of paper with a handwritten message. There are truths that are sung, others that are kept silent. You knew how to do both. HP. I didn't need any more initials. Camille smiled. Poirot always knew how to withdraw just before the last note ended. Like a good invisible conductor, he disappeared as soon as harmony was restored. Summer arrived in Saint-Rémy-de-Vent. With it, young music students came to practice at the villa at Camille's invitation. The house was filled with badly played scales, off-key laughter, mistakes, and hope. Camille listened to them from the gallery, a cup of coffee in her hand. Neither of them fully knew the story of Eloise or Lucas Feld. They didn't need to. They weren't there to worship, but to create. And in a corner of the room, on a music stand, a single score always remained open. The sonata. No frills, no frame, just paper, just music. Because sometimes the most important thing is not who composed it, but who lets it play. Chapter 12. The Last Bar. Autumn returned to Saint-Rémy-de-Vent like a symphony in minor. The leaves fell gracefully, carpeting the village's paths. The voice of the wind and the air carried the damp scent of earth, chestnuts, and freshly lit firewood. The house, which had once held secrets like sealed scores, now opened up fearlessly, like a notebook already written. And yet, one last measure remained to be written. Camille woke up with a new unease, a faint feeling, like a melody hiding in the ear, unknowingly. For weeks she had believed everything had been resolved. The identity of the culprit, the truth about the sonata, the restoration of Lucas Feld's name, and, in essence, her aunt's legacy. But something still whispered in the margins of that story, something unspoken. It was that morning when he received a telegram. Miss Dervaux, the last chord has not yet sounded. Could you welcome an old friend who can't bear to leave a book without an epilogue? HP, when Hercule Poirot arrived at the villa. The sky was overcast, and the wind was blowing leaves as if organizing the landscape. His figure, though small, stood erect with dignity. He was dressed in light grey, with a neatly knotted silk scarf, and carrying a slim briefcase that he never let go of. Camille greeted him with genuine joy. She made tea in the same room where it all began, the silent and respectful piano at her back. I didn't think you'd come back, Monsieur Poirot, he said with a smile. Nor I, until something spoke to me from my memories, he replied as he sat down. The score has been executed. Justice has been done. But the details, mademoiselle, the details, they always hide the ultimate truth. Camille looked at him, intrigued. Poirot opened his briefcase and took out an envelope. Inside was a German newspaper clipping dated 1933, a few weeks after Lucas Feld's death. The headline was brief. Viennese violinist commits suicide after its unsolved scandal. "This article was discreetly filed away," said Poirot. "It wasn't even circulated outside Austria. But look here." He pointed to an underlined line. "The police received an anonymous letter warning that the young violinist's fall was caused by a private argument with another figure at the conservatory. However, the letter was dismissed due to lack of evidence." Camille read slowly. "Are you implying that someone tried to raise the alarm and was ignored?" Poirot nodded. "That's right. And I found another copy of that letter among the archives of a music library in Graz, signed with only an initial," and Camille remained silent. "My aunt?" "Yes," Poirot said gently. "His aunt tried to save him. She tried to denounce Leclerc before it was all over, not out of revenge, but out of conscience. But she was silenced by the system, by the times, and by her own position." Poirot stood up, walking towards the piano. "The act of reconstructing the sonata wasn't just an artistic act, mademoiselle. It was an act of redemption. The music wasn't revenge. It was an inverted confession. She redeemed not only Lucas, but herself. So he did it all, because he didn't forgive himself." "Exactly. And that," said Poirot, gently touching a key, "is the true ending of this story. Not the resolution of a crime, but the echo of guilt transformed into beauty." Later, before leaving, Poirot and Camille walked through the vineyards, already tinged with ochre. The sun broke through the clouds like a spotlight on a final scene. "And you, Monsieur Poirot," Camille asked, "do you think this story will change you?" Poirot stopped, looking at the horizon. "Oh, mademoiselle, every story changes me. A little. Some challenge me, others move me. But this one, reminds me that sometimes justice doesn't prevail. Recompone, like a broken chord that over time finds its resolution." Camille silently accompanied him to the train. Before boarding, Poirot turned around with a gentle look. "And remember, mademoiselle, crime can be solved, a secret may be revealed, but a truth written in music never dies." The train departed with its long, melancholy whistle. And the voice of the wind. He was at peace at last, not because he had kept silent, but because he had made it sound.